Hi, this week we're going to talk about session and cookies within the ASP.NET Core MVC framework. So by default or by nature, HTTP or Hypertext Transfer Protocol is stateless. So what that means is whenever a request is made to a server and the response is sent back to the client, after that nothing else is remembered by the server. So all the variables and whatever was passed to the server, so the models, the whatever was passed back to the browser, the view, or the JSON, or whatever the case might have been, is gone. So essentially, a request is made to the server, which might have been some data, whether it be a post or a put request. The operation is then done on the server, and then once the operation is complete, information could or could not be sent back to the browser or the client. And then once the client views that information, or once that information is either painted to the web browser or sent to the network tab or whatever the case might have been, the information is gone from the server. So while it might seem as if the information is still there because you can see it on your browser in the version or in the form of HTML or JavaScript or JSON, although you can see it with your eyes, that information only exists on the client. So we need to find some way to get that information back to the server if that's what we desire, or it's gone. So that's what we talk with when we talk about state. That's what state is. So you might have heard something called REST APIs or RESTful APIs, and what those are application programming interfaces or APIs that transfer the information to essentially the next hop. So whether that next hop be a website or another web service, what happens is we request information, much like we do in a website. We request information, the API gives us back that information, so it essentially transfers that state to the next hop, whether that hop be a website or it's just simply viewing that JSON. So there's many ways you can consume RESTful APIs. Usually it's with another API or with a website or some sort of view. So since we make requests to a controller or a server, we need to figure out some way to hold that state if it's something that we want to keep. And there's a few different ways we can do that in ASP.NET Core. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide here. So as you can see, we use session and cookies to store user data that could persist across multiple requests. Or we could also use cookies that could persist across multiple sessions. And cookies are actually physical files that are stored on the host computer on the client. That way, whenever somebody maybe goes back to your website, we can look for that cookie or whatever cookie we might have put on their computer to figure out if they've already been to our site, maybe some settings that they chose while they're on our site, etc. So here's some common features we can use to maintain state in ASP.NET Core MVC. We've already used a hidden field, so essentially a model is passed back, whether it be a view model or an entity, and that is passed to the view, and what we can do is put some of that information in a hidden field. That way, once that information is there, we can model bind it or pass that information back to the controller since everything was gone. Like I said, that information still exists on the client. We just need to put it there and keep it there, and we can do that in a hidden field. Another way we can represent state or transfer state back to the controller or information is via a query string. So if you are familiar with URLs, if you have a question mark in a URL and a variable after that, that's considered a query string. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. We talked about a cookie already. So a cookie is a physical file that we put on the host computer or on the client. That way we can go back and look to see if they've already logged onto our website or has any sort of information there. and session state. So session state is something, instead of being kept on the host computer, session state is kept on the server. So we can tell the server, okay, this user has reached out to our website, and let's go ahead and store this information in case they want to use it later for their session. A couple other ways for maintaining state that we've already worked with are routes. So you can keep track of where you're at in your web session, and temp data, which we used back in our NFL application. Well, we wanted to keep exactly which division and conference that the user was currently looking at, and that temp data that we learned is only kept for when it's read. So whenever it's read, it goes away. So it's only kept for a short period of time. So these up here are more concrete or longer lasting versions of state, except for query string and hidden field. Those will be gone after the request is made. Or in the case for query string, they'll be gone whenever you change the URL, and hidden field will be gone whenever that view changes. So here's a couple ways that ASP.NET Core keeps track of a session. You can look at this. It's just pretty simple. Passes back a session, or passes back session to the web server, and then it passes back that session ID to the browser. So that way, when it makes another request, it can use that session ID to see exactly what that user has in session for that current request. And here's a couple different ways to configure our app to use session state, which we'll also talk about when I do the demonstration. But essentially, we go back to our startup.cs. Remember, our startup.cs file is the file that we use to pretty much configure all the middleware for our application. So anything that happens between the ASP.NET Core request coming into our, say, for example, our IIS or Kestrel instance, we're going to configure all that in the startup.cs file. So here we can add session, services.add session, and then we can also add memory cache. So maybe if we want to cache something on the server, such as a large data set, we can configure that here. And notice it must be called before add controllers with views. So if we have add controllers with views, before we do that, we must tell it that we want to use memory cache in session. That way the controllers can configure that whenever they start up. And then we also tell the application to use session here, which, as you can see, must be called before the use endpoints method here. Here's some different ways to change the default session state. So you notice that whenever we call the services.add session, we can go ahead and pass in the options. So these options are passed in via dependency injection. So whenever somebody asks for, I'm not sure which object this is, but it's probably like an iOptions object or something like that. So whenever the framework asks for this type of object, it's then passed in via dependency injection. That we can go ahead and change those particular options here within the services.add session method call. So for example, how long should it take for the session to time out? So if anyone has ever had their session timeout before, so maybe if they were sitting on a website such as Amazon.com or something like that, logged in for maybe more than an hour, that's configured here. So exactly how long they should be idle before the time's out or they're kicked off of the website. Is this HTTP only? Is the cookie HTTP only? The default is true. Usually that's best case scenario. It's there's usually some security vulnerabilities for cookies or anything other than HTTP only, so it's usually best to leave this as true. And then is the cookie essential? It's defaulted to false, so it's usually best to keep that as false as well. It probably does some stuff under the hood where if that cookie isn't there, it might throw an exception or blow up since the cookie is essential. Okay, so now we're getting into the nuts and bolts of using a session. So let's go ahead and in the next video, I'll start digging into what it means to have a session in your ASP.NET Core web application. So I'll see you there.